The deputy held the paper away from his body, as if the cold might make it bite. Across the yard, a woman stood beside a wash line where shirts had frozen into boards, her fingers raw, a boy pressed against her hip coughing into wool. Steam rose from somewhere below the cliff behind the cabin, thick, sulphurous, curling apart in the wind before it cleared the edge. The deputy read the number aloud. Then he read the deadline. The woman did not look at him. She was looking past him, down at the steam, at the heat pouring out of the earth and running away to nothing. 13 days before, Marit Vangen had been a wife. Now she stood on frozen ground outside a cabin that was not hers in any way that mattered, watching a sheriff's deputy fold his paper back into his coat and ride away without looking at her again. The claim was Amos's. The debt was Amos's. The cabin, the cliff, the spring below it, the 3 hens scratching at ice in the yard, the milk goat bleeding from the shed, the 2 rusted wagon wheels leaning against the north wall, all Amos's. What belonged to Marit was the boy coughing behind the blanket partition and the old woman whose swollen hands could no longer close around a bucket handle. Vangen Gulch sat 8 miles outside Boise, up a track that froze solid by November and did not thaw until April. The cabin measured 16 by 20 feet. 1 room. 1 stove that drew smoke back into the space when the wind came from the northwest, which it did most nights from October through March. The walls were rough-sawn pine with mud chinking that crumbled when the temperature dropped hard. The roof leaked at the northeast corner. Amos had meant to fix it. Amos had meant to do many things. The deputy's visit had not been a surprise. Marit had found the debt paper in Amos's coat the night she washed the blood from it. $118 owed to Dace Pritchard, storekeeper, lender, and the man who held paper on half the claims between the Gulch and town. The terms were written in Pritchard's own hand. Pay $30 by New Year's Day and arrange the balance by spring thaw or surrender the claim. 90 days. That was what the deputy's visit confirmed. 90 days to find money that did not exist. Marit pulled the wash from the line because the shirts had frozen into boards and would crack if she left them. Her fingers were raw. The wind cut through her wool coat at the seams where the lining had worn through. Behind the cabin, the gulch dropped away steeply, and from the bottom of that drop, she could hear the spring, hot water hissing over black rock, sending up a column of steam that the cold air tore apart before it rose higher than the cliff edge. That spring was the reason Amos had filed the claim. It was the reason Dace Pritchard wanted the claim back. And it was the reason Marit hauled water twice a day in 2 iron-handled buckets down a switchback path that dropped 50 vertical feet in 140 feet of walking, each trip carrying more than 50 pounds back up on legs that shook by the second load. She had done this every day since Amos died. Before that, Amos had done it. Before Amos, nobody had bothered, because nobody had been fool enough to build a cabin above a hot spring without a way to move the water up. The spring emerged from the hillside at roughly 150 degrees, hot enough to scald a hand in seconds, hot enough to send steam rolling across the gulch floor like fog. The locals called it boiling, though it was not quite that. It ran through a natural channel, dropped over a shelf of sulfur-stained rock, and emptied into the creek below. All that heat running downhill, running away, running to nothing. And 50 feet above it, a boy coughed into a blanket partition, and the stove ate wood faster than a widow could cut it. Marit's woodpile stood at 1 1/4 cords. She had measured it the morning after the funeral, walking the stack with her arms spread, counting. 1 cord is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. She had that, and a quarter more. Her neighbor to the north, Tollef Aasen, had come to check on her that same morning. He was a decent man, quiet, 43 years old, a widower himself who understood what the first weeks felt like. He had looked at the woodpile and then looked away. "How much do I need?" Marit had asked. Tollef had not wanted to answer. She asked again. 6 cords, he said. If you heat only the one room and keep the stove running day and night. 6 minimum, and that is a mild winter. 1 1/4. She needed 6. The gap was 4 3/4 cords, and each cord took a strong man with a good axe the better part of 2 days to fell, buck, split, and stack. Marit was not weak, but she was alone with a sick boy, a crippled woman, and 90 days before she lost the right to be cold here at all. In the flour tin behind the stove, she kept $11.60. That was everything. 2 sacks of flour, 1 sack of beans. The goat gave milk, but less each week as the feed ran low. The hens had stopped laying when the cold came. Eli, her brother, 10 years old, sent to live with her and Amos after their mother died in Eau Claire the previous spring, coughed every night now. Not the sharp bark of a chest cold, a wet, deep pulling sound that came from below the ribs. When the cabin warmed, the coughing eased. When the stove burned low in the hours before dawn, the coughing woke Rana, and Rana's worry woke Marit, and Marit rose to feed the stove with wood she could not replace. This was the math. $11 against 118 owed, 1 1/4 cords against 6 needed, a spring full of heat she could not reach, a boy who breathed easier only when the room was warm, a creditor who wanted the claim, not the money, and a widow whom every reasonable person in the territory would advise to give up, move to town, hire herself out as laundry help, and save what she could. Every reasonable person. Tolliff was the first to say it plainly, and he said it without cruelty, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. You could board with Mrs. Kessler in town. She takes women. Eli could work for the printer. Ragna could... Ragna cannot climb stairs, Marit said. She cannot carry a plate. If I put her in a boarding house, she sits in a chair until she dies. Tolliff did not argue. He knew she was right. Ragna Vangen's rheumatism had bent her fingers into hooks. She could hold a spoon if Marit placed it carefully. She could not dress without help. In a boarding house, she would be a burden, and burdens in boarding houses did not last long. Eli's cough, Tolliff said, gets better when the room stays warm. You cannot keep the room warm, not with what you have. Marit looked past him at the steam rising from below the cliff. I have heat, she said. I just cannot move it. Tolliff followed her gaze. He understood the frustration. Everyone who had ever stood above that spring understood it. Thousands of degrees of heat pouring out of the earth, running downhill, warming nothing but rocks and creek water. And 50 feet above, people burned wood to survive. You would need a pump, Tolliff said. Steam engine, boiler, pipe. That is $100 you do not have. I know. Then why are you staring at the spring? Marit did not answer. She did not have an answer yet. Hiram Bell arrived 4 days later, at Tolliff's request. Bell was 58, employed by the Boise Waterworks Department, and before that had spent 20 years as a mill mechanic in the Clearwater camps. He was the kind of man who understood pipe, pressure, and flow the way a farrier understood hooves, from long practice, not from books, though he owned books and cited them freely. He was not unkind, he was precise. And precision, applied to Marit's situation, was devastating. Bell walked the property in silence for 20 minutes. He descended the switchback. He stood beside the spring for several minutes, watching the flow, estimating volume with his eyes. He crouched and touched the water with one finger, pulled it back, and wiped it on his coat. He climbed back up, breathing hard from the grade, and stood in Marit's yard looking at the cabin, the shed, the woodpile, and the cliff edge as if he were reading a page of numbers that added to 0. You have a spring below you, Bell said. A house above it and no pump between. That is not a heating system. That is a cliff. Marit waited. Bell described the conventional solution. A small steam pump, fed by a wood-fired boiler, driving hot water through machined valves and iron pipe up the grade. Fuel cost, ongoing. Valve maintenance, regular, someone with mechanical knowledge to tend it, and the initial cost. $90 for a modest rig, Bell said. $140 if you want it to survive a winter, not including the pipe, which you would need at least 70 feet of, at $1.20 per foot for 1-inch iron. $84 for pipe alone, plus $90 to $140 for the pump assembly, against $11.60 in a flour tin. I cannot help you, Bell said. I can tell you what is needed, and I can tell you that what is needed is beyond your means. I'm sorry for that. He paused at the edge of the property before mounting his horse. Do not attempt to move hot water uphill without proper power, he said. Pressure in enclosed pipe is not a game. Hot water under pressure will burst a fitting and take your hand off, or worse. I have seen it. He rode out. Marit watched him go. Then she walked to the cliff edge and looked down at the spring again. The steam curled up and vanished. Below it, the creek carried the heat away. She had no pump, no money for a pump, no knowledge of how to build a pump, and an expert had just told her it could not be done without one. But there was something Bell had said that she could not stop hearing. He had described the danger of hot water under pressure, the force it carried, the violence when a valve failed or a fitting cracked. He spoke of it as a threat. Marit heard it as a description of power. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived in pieces, and the first piece arrived through pain. 6 days after Bell's visit, Marit slipped on the cliff path. The sulfur ice that glazed the switchback caught her left boot, and she went down hard on one knee, both buckets swinging. The left bucket hit the rock wall. The right bucket left her grip entirely, arced out over the path, and struck the ground below. 3 gallons of near-scalding water exploded across the frozen slope. The water ran. It found a groove in the rock, a natural channel no wider than a man's thumb, and ran downhill through it. At the bottom of the groove, the water struck a flat stone and made a sound. A slap. Then another. Then another. The flow was pulsing because the groove narrowed and widened, and each pulse hit the flat stone with a regular beat that echoed off the cliff wall. Marit sat in the snow, with her knee throbbing, and her right wrist burned where the hot water had caught it. She watched the water pulse. She listened to the rhythm, and something in the sound reached back 20 years to a grist mill in Wisconsin. Her father, Bernd Brecke, had been a millwright. Not a famous one, not an inventor. A man who kept water wheels turning and mill races clear and knew more about moving water through wooden channels than most engineers learned from their books. He had worked at Halverson's mill outside Eau Claire, and Marit had spent days there as a child, sitting on grain sacks, watching the wheel turn, listening to the sounds that a building full of water and wood and stone made when everything was running. One afternoon she had been 7, maybe 8. Her father had pressed her palm flat against a pipe in the mill basement. The pipe was warm and wet with condensation. She could feel a low vibration running through the iron. Water moves, Bernd had said. And when you stop moving water too fast, it strikes, like a hammer inside the pipe. He had opened a gate valve slowly, letting her feel the flow steady. Then he had shut it fast. The pipe jumped under her hand. She pulled away, and he laughed. Dangerous, he had said. Not useful. Never do that to a pipe you need to keep. He had taught her the warning, not the principle. But the principle was in the warning, and the sound of that pipe jumping was the same sound the spilled water made when it struck the flat stone below her on the cliff. Water in motion carried force. When you stopped it suddenly, the force did not disappear. It went somewhere. It pushed. Marit climbed back up the path with one empty bucket and one half full and a burn on her wrist that would blister by evening. She did not go inside. She went to the shed and opened Amos's trunk, the one he kept tools and papers in. Under a tangle of harness leather and a broken awl, She found a stack of catalog pages he had saved, feed prices, hardware listings, an advertisement for barbed wire, and one page torn from a mechanic's supply catalog showing a device labeled Rife's hydraulic ram for raising spring water to farmhouses without steam or fuel. The drawing was small, the description was smaller, but the principle was visible. Water flowing downhill through a pipe struck a valve. The valve closed. The impact forced a portion of the water upward through a second valve and into a delivery pipe. The rest of the water wasted out through the first valve, which then reopened, and the cycle repeated, over and over, no engine, no fuel. The falling water powered itself. Moret read the page 3 times. The drawing was incomplete. It showed the ram body and the 2 valves, but not the air chamber that cushioned the pressure pulse. It did not show the dimensions or the pipe sizes. It did not explain how to build one from salvage, but it showed her that the principle was real. Someone had already made water climb by using the force of water falling. She tested it that night with what she had. A coffee pot, a tin tube salvaged from a lamp chimney, a hinged flap cut from stove iron with Amos's tin snips. She ran water from the cabin basin through the tube, let it fall, and slammed the flap closed. The first 5 attempts failed. The flap stuck open. The tube leaked at the joint. The water sputtered but did not rise. On the 6th attempt, the flap caught. The tube kicked, and a jet of hot water spurted from the top and hit the ceiling. It was not controlled. It was not useful. Eli laughed until the water arced sideways and splashed the floor near Ragna's chair, and Ragna pulled him back with a sound that was half fear and half fury. But the water had risen, not by much, not reliably, not safely, but it had risen. The force was real. Moret sat on the floor beside the mess and said it aloud, not to anyone, just to hear the words. It does not need to lift all of it, only enough. The spring wastes the rest anyway. That was the key. The spring threw away thousands of gallons a day, all of it rushing downhill, all of it cooling in the creek, all of it useless. If she could capture the fall, use the momentum of most of that flow to push a small amount uphill, the waste would not matter. The spring could afford to lose. She only needed it to win a little. Tolef came the next morning because he had heard the banging and thought something had collapsed. Moret showed him the coffee pot wreckage, the wet ceiling, and the catalog page. He stood at the table reading it with his lips moving, then set it down and looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he suspects is lame. "You are trying to make water climb," Tolef said, "because it first ran downhill. That sounds like a preacher's trick." "It is not a trick. The force is real. My father showed me." "Your father showed you pipes bursting." "He showed me where the force goes." Tolef crossed his arms. He was not a man who argued for the pleasure of it. He argued because he had buried a wife and understood what happened to people who chased hope instead of cutting wood. "How much water does it lift?" he asked. "A fraction. Most goes to waste." "And you will run this fraction 50 feet uphill." "Through a pipe. The force pushes it." "Through iron pipe you do not have, with fittings you cannot afford, using a machine you have never built, to heat a cabin that needs 6 cords of wood and has 1. Moret did not answer the arithmetic. Instead, she filled the coffee pot from the basin, set the tin tube upright on the table, and told Tolef to hold it. He held it with the wariness of a man handling something that might spit at him. She let the water run through the tube, then slammed the rag-wrapped flap against the bottom opening. The tube kicked against Tolef's boot. Water jumped 3 inches above the top. "That is not 50 feet, Tolef said. "That is a coffee pot," Moret said. "Give me 28 feet of drive pipe and a proper valve and it will be different." Tolef set the tube down. He looked at her for a long time. He did not believe. But he had felt the kick in the pipe, and he could not unfeel it. Where will you get 28 feet of pipe? He asked. I do not know yet. He left without offering to help, but he left without telling her to stop. For Tolef, that was as close to encouragement as grief allowed. The gossip reached Dace Pritchard's store within a week. In a gulch of fewer than 40 souls, nothing stayed private for long, least of all the spectacle of a widow dragging scrap iron down a cliff path to build something no one understood. Marit had begun collecting material. 2 lengths of pipe from a collapsed mine at it 3 miles uphill, a wagon hub plate that might serve as a valve face, hinge pins from a broken gate, a section of old boiler tube she found half buried behind the assay office in town, abandoned when the assessor moved to a new building. She carried each piece down to the spring, arranged them on a flat rock, and studied how they might fit together. The arrangement looked, to anyone passing, like a junk pile assembled by a person who had lost her senses. Dace Pritchard was the first to say so publicly. He was a man who had learned that other people's misfortune was the cheapest commodity in the territory, and he bought it whenever he could. The spring claim was valuable, not for what Marit was doing with it, but for what it could become if hot water bathing, laundry, or greenhouse operations ever reached Boise money. He needed Marit gone, and a widow behaving strangely was the easiest kind to dislodge. Marit went to his store on a Tuesday to trade Amos's harness buckle for pipe fittings. She needed 2 threaded elbows and a reducing coupler. Dace examined the buckle, turned it over twice, and offered her 15 cents. The buckle was worth at least $1. Marit told him so. Dace set the buckle on the counter and leaned forward on his elbows. He spoke at a volume that carried to the 3 men warming themselves by the stove at the back of the store. A widow with no team has no business owning a cliff, Dace said. And a widow spending her time building pipe toys beside a hot spring has no business being trusted with store credit. Marit did not flinch. She had expected this. She picked up the buckle, put it back in her coat pocket, and asked if he had the fittings or not. I have the fittings, Dace said. 30 cents for the pair. Cash. She counted out 30 cents from the $11.60 that was all she had in the world. $11.30 remained. Dace made the exchange slowly, letting the men at the stove watch. After Marit left, she heard laughter through the closed door. The name started that week. Marit's Clanking prayer, the men called it. The widow's scarecrow. Children dared each other to run down the cliff path and touch the pipe pile. Women who might have helped with food or firewood kept their distance because association with madness carried its own cost in a small community. Hiram Bell returned 3 days later. Not at Tolef's request this time, on his own, because someone in town had told him what Marit was building, and he felt a professional obligation to warn her before she killed herself. He stood beside the spring, looking at the salvaged fittings laid out on the flat rock. He picked up the boiler tube and examined the inside. He tested the hinge pins. He looked at the wagon hub plate and set it down carefully. This is a ram pump, Bell said. Part of one. You know what a ram pump does. I know what it is supposed to do. Bell straightened up. For a moment, something that might have been respect crossed his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the expression of a man who has seen enough accidents to recognize the conditions for one. A ram pump uses water hammer, Bell said, the same force that bursts boiler seams and splits pipe joints. You're proposing to generate that force deliberately in salvaged iron, beside water hot enough to take the skin off your arm, and run it through pipe held together with prayer and hinge pins. I know the risks. You know some of the risks. You do not know what happens when an air chamber waterlogs in a sealed system. You do not know what mineral scale does to a check valve in 60 days. You do not know how fast a threaded union will corrode in sulfur water. Then tell me. Bell stared at her. In his experience, people who built dangerous things did not ask for a list of dangers. They argued. They dismissed. They accused the expert of not understanding their vision. This woman was asking him to catalog every way her machine could fail. "What pressure does a boiler seam take before it lets go?" Marit asked. Bell answered before he could stop himself. 80 to 100 pounds per square inch for good iron, less for salvage, far less for corroded fittings. Marit took a pencil stub from her pocket and wrote the number on the back of the catalog page. "What else?" she said. Bell told her about thermal expansion in closed iron, how a sealed pipe full of hot water with no room to expand became a bomb. He told her about water hammer amplitude, the spike in pressure when a heavy valve closed against flowing water. He told her that a 1-inch pipe carrying 150-degree water at even moderate pressure could turn a cracked fitting into shrapnel. Marit wrote all of it down. Bell watched her write. He was accustomed to being deferred to, or argued with, or ignored. He was not accustomed to being used as a source of specifications by the person he was warning. "You are building a boiler without a boiler house," Bell said, "without relief valves, without gauges, without anyone to call when it goes wrong." "I am building a ram pump," Marit said. "It is open at the waste valve. It cannot build the pressure you are describing unless I seal it wrong." Bell opened his mouth, closed it. She was right on that specific point, and he knew it. A ram pump's waste valve opened every cycle, releasing pressure. It was not a sealed boiler, but the delivery side, where the pressurized pulse climbed toward the cabin, that was where the danger lived. "The delivery line," Bell said. "If your check valve sticks closed and the air chamber fails, you will have a sealed column of hot water under hammer pressure with nowhere to go. Then I need a relief bypass on the delivery side. You need to stop this." Marit folded the catalog page and put it in her pocket beside the pencil stub. "Thank you for the specifications," she said. Bell left. He did not say goodbye. He was, for the first time in a long career, uncertain whether he had just prevented an accident or provided the blueprints for one. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who was certain they understood the problem better than you did? That night, Ragna spoke from behind the blanket partition. Her voice was steady in a way that frightened Marit more than anger would have. "Dace Pritchard will use this," Ragna said. "He will tell the county you are not fit to hold the claim. He will say grief has turned your mind, and a woman building a pipe contraption beside a boiling spring while her brother coughs and her mother-in-law cannot walk. That is a story he can sell." Marit said nothing. "I am not telling you to stop," Ragna said. "I am telling you what happens if you fail." From beyond the partition, Eli coughed. The sound was wet and deep and came from a place in his chest that no amount of blankets could warm. The stove ticked. The woodpile outside, measured that morning, stood at 1 cord and an eighth. Less than yesterday. Less than last week. Less every day, with no way to replace what burned. Marit lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of her household. The cough, the breathing, the creak of old joints as Ragna shifted in her chair. Outside, far below, the spring hissed. The steam rose. The heat ran downhill to nothing. She would begin building in the morning, not because she believed it would work, because the alternative was to sit in a cooling cabin and count the days until the wood ran out, or Dace took the claim, whichever came first. And Marit Vangen, daughter of a millwright, widow of a freighter, guardian of a sick boy and a broken woman, was not built for sitting. The first pipe went into the ground beside the spring on October the 29th. The temperature was 31 degrees at dawn. Marit's hands shook, and not from cold. She set the boiler tube upright in the channel where the spring water ran fastest, wedged it between 2 rocks, and watched the hot water fill the tube from the bottom. The spring box came first. Without a clean intake, grit and mineral flakes would clog every valve she tried to build. Marit spent 2 full days hauling flat stones from the creek bed, stacking them into a basin 3 feet wide around the point where the spring emerged from the slope. She set a plank screen across the mouth, rough-sawn pine with gaps narrow enough to catch pebbles, wide enough to pass water. The screen clogged within hours. She pulled it, scraped the mineral crust with a knife, and replaced it. It would need cleaning every day. One more task in a list that already exceeded the hours she had. From the spring box, she laid the salvaged boiler tube as the first section of drive pipe. The tube was only 4 feet long. She needed 28 feet total, dropping 9 feet from the spring run down to where the ram body would sit. 24 feet of pipe she did not have. She found 8 feet buried in the mud below the collapsed mine adit. Rusted, but the walls were thick enough. She traded Amos's second-best harness for 6 feet of 1-inch iron from a freighter passing through who had overstock from a canceled order. That cost her nothing in cash, but everything in future hauling capacity. She had no horse, no mule, and now no spare harness. 14 feet of pipe acquired, 14 still missing. The weather answered with the cruelty of a creditor. On November the 3rd, the first hard freeze locked the cliff path in a shell of ice that did not melt for 6 days. Marit hacked steps into the slope with a hand axe, each swing jarring her shoulders until the muscles knotted and would not release at night. The sulfur steam from the spring coated every cold surface with a slick mineral glaze that refroze harder than the ice beneath it. She fell twice in one morning. The second fall opened a gash on her shin that bled through her wool stocking and froze there. She kept working. The ram body had to sit at the low point of the drive pipe, where the falling water would build maximum momentum before striking the waste valve. Marit chose a shelf of rock 6 feet below the spring box and 9 feet lower in elevation, enough drop to generate force, according to her father's lessons about mill races and head pressure. She cleared the shelf with a pry bar, her arms burning with the effort, and began assembling what she had. The waste valve was the heart of the machine. When open, it let the drive water flow freely, building speed. When the flow hit a certain velocity, the water's own force would slam the valve shut. That sudden stop, the hammer blow her father had warned her about, would send a pressure pulse up through the delivery valve and into the pipe climbing toward the cabin. Then the waste valve would fall open again under its own weight, and the cycle would repeat. 1 clank per cycle. 1 pulse of water pushed uphill each time. She built the waste valve from the wagon hub plate, drilling a hole through the center with Amos's brace and bit, threading a hinge pin through it so the plate could swing freely. The plate weighed almost 3 pounds, too heavy, and it would not open fast enough to let the water build speed. Too light, and the water would push it shut before enough momentum built. She had no way to calculate the correct weight. She could only test, fail, adjust, and test again. The first test came on November the 9th. Marit connected 12 feet of drive pipe, all she had assembled so far, to the spring box, ran it down the slope to the ram body on the rock shelf, and let the water flow. The hot spring water filled the pipe and poured through the open waste valve, splashing across the rocks below. She waited for the valve to slam shut. The water flowed. The valve hung open, the hub plate swinging lazily on its pin, the current not fast enough to close it. Not enough pipe, not enough drop, not enough speed. Marit sat on the wet rock with steam curling around her legs, and 12 feet of pipe that proved nothing except that she needed the other 16 feet she could not find. Above her, the cabin chimney trailed thin smoke. The woodpile was down to 1 cord even. Eli had coughed blood into his handkerchief that morning, a single red thread in the phlegm that Marit had seen and Eli had tried to hide. 53 days until Dace Pritchard's deadline. 16 feet of pipe she could not buy. A valve that would not close. A boy bleeding into cloth. And the spring kept running, heat pouring downhill. Wasted. Useless. As if the earth itself were mocking her. She stood up, wiped her hands on her coat, and began walking toward the collapsed mine adit to search for more pipe. The temperature was dropping. Snow was coming. And somewhere between the rust and the rock, there had to be 16 more feet of iron that nobody wanted except a widow who could not afford to stop looking. She found 9 feet in a ditch behind the stamp mill at the old Redbird claim, buried under a season of pine needles and mud. The pipe was pitted on the outside, but sound within. She carried it back in 2 pieces across her shoulders, 3 miles over broken ground, and arrived at the gulch after dark with her back seized and her vision swimming, 7 feet still missing. On November the 12th, Tollef Asen rode into her yard with a coil of used telegraph wire on his saddle and a 4-foot section of 1-inch iron pipe tied alongside it. He did not dismount. He dropped both in the dirt near the shed and looked at her with an expression that was closer to resignation than generosity. "The wire is for bracing," Tollef said. "The pipe is from my fence post driver. I will not need it until spring." "Thank you." "It is not belief," Tollef said. "It is cheaper than burying you." He rode out. Marit stood in the yard holding the pipe section and did the math. 4 feet from Tollef, 9 from the Redbird ditch, 8 from the mine adit, 4 from the original boiler tube, 6 from the freighter's overstock. 31 feet of drive pipe. She needed 28. She had enough, with 3 feet to spare for cutting and fitting. For the first time since Amos died, something in the numbers added instead of subtracted. Wajan, but pipe without proper valves was a tunnel, not a machine. And Marit's waste valve, the wagon hub plate on its hinge pin, still would not close with the right timing. The water pushed it shut too slowly, or not at all, or slammed it so hard the pin bent. She needed the valve to swing freely, build speed in the open position, and then snap closed at the precise moment the water reached full velocity. She could not achieve that with a flat plate and a bent hinge. She was kneeling beside the ram body on November the 15th, grinding the hub plate against a flat stone to smooth its face, when she heard boots on the cliff path and looked up to see a man she had never met descending through the steam. He was old, 66, though she did not know that yet, tall, with a frame that had been powerful and was now whittled by years and labor into something hard and narrow. He carried a blacksmith's tool roll under one arm and wore a coat patched so many times the original cloth was visible only at the collar. His beard was white. His hands were black at the knuckles from decades of forge work. Odmund Kavama had come to the gulch to mend Tollef Asen's broken sled runner, a job worth $2 and a meal. He had heard the irregular banging from below the cliff while eating that meal in Tollef's kitchen, and he had asked what it was. Tollef had told him, the widow, the pipe, the hot spring, the prayer. Odmund had set down his fork and walked out without finishing. He stood now at the edge of the rock shelf, watching Marit grind the hub plate. He watched for a long time. She was aware of him, but did not stop. She had learned in the past weeks that stopping to explain herself invited dismissal, and she could not afford to lose another hour. Odmund looked at the spring box, the drive pipe, the ram body, the hub plate, the hinge pin. He looked at the charcoal marks on the rock where Marit had recorded each failed test, a vertical line for each attempt, a cross through the ones that had produced any upward pulse at all. 3 crosses, 14 lines. "You are not guessing," Odmund said. "You are listening." Marit stopped grinding. She looked at him. "The marks," he said. Each one tells you something different. You are tracking the failures. The failures are all I have so far. Odmund set his tool roll on a dry rock and unrolled it. Inside were files, punches, a small hammer, tongs, a set of calipers, and a valve-seating tool that Marit had never seen before, a brass cylinder with a fine, abrasive face. "Your valve face is rough," Odmund said. "It will never seat cleanly against a rough mating surface. The water finds the gaps and bleeds through instead of building the hammer pulse." He picked up the hub plate and ran his thumb across its face. "Feel that," he said, and handed it to her. She felt the tiny ridges, the pits, the unevenness that her stone grinding had not removed. "Now feel this." He handed her a piece of flat iron from his roll, polished so smooth it felt oiled. The difference was immediate. One surface caught her skin, the other let it slide. "A valve must seal like a kiss," Odmund said. "No gaps, no breath between. When it closes, the water has nowhere to go but up." He showed her how to use fine sand mixed with tallow as a lapping compound, spreading it between the valve face and a flat iron plate, then rotating the hub plate in slow circles, pressing down with even weight. The grit cut the high spots. The tallow carried the waste. After 30 minutes, the valve face was smoother than anything Marit had produced in 3 days of stone grinding. "Try it now," Odmund said. They fitted the hub plate back onto its hinge pin and set it in the ram body. Marit opened the spring box gate. Water filled the drive pipe, flowed down the slope, and poured through the open waste valve. The hub plate hung on its pin, the water pushing against it, the current building speed through 28 feet of iron. The plate swung. The water caught it. The valve slammed shut. The pipe jumped. A sound like a hammer striking an anvil rang off the cliff wall, and from the delivery valve, a mine pump check valve that Marit had salvaged and seated with leather, a pulse of hot water shot upward into the short test section of delivery pipe, 3 feet of rise. Then the waste valve fell open under its own weight, the pressure dropped, and the cycle began again. Clank. Pause. Clank. Pause. Clank. The rhythm was uneven. The rise was short, but the water climbed. Odmund watched the pulse with his arms crossed. He did not smile. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he sees something he expected but needed to confirm. "The air chamber," he said. "Without it, the pulse is too sharp. It will hammer the fittings apart in a week." "I know. I do not have a chamber." Odmund looked at the old boiler tube she had not yet used, the one 3 feet long with the cracked weld at one end. "Seal that," he said, pointing to the crack. "Stand it upright on the delivery side. Trap air in the top half. The air compresses with each pulse and smooths the hammer. Without it, you are punching the pipe. With it, you are pushing." They spent the rest of that day building the air chamber. Odmund showed Marit how to seal the cracked weld with lead poured from melted rifle balls, a field repair he had used in mining camps when proper solder was unavailable. He made her do the pour herself, guiding her hands only when the lead ran too fast. The chamber would not hold against high pressure, but a ram pump's delivery side ran at modest pressure if the bypass stayed open. It would hold long enough to prove the principle. By dusk, the ram had an air chamber. The clank softened, the pulse smoothed. The delivery pipe, still only a test stub, not the full 50-foot run to the cabin, showed a steadier flow. Not a spurt, but a push. Odmund stayed through supper. Rana fed him beans and bread and said nothing about the pipework. Eli watched him from behind the blanket partition with the cautious fascination of a boy who has learned that adults who arrive usually bring bad news. "Where did you learn pipe fitting?" Marit asked. "Butte, Coeur d'Alene, Haley. Wherever they needed someone to keep water flowing in a mine, and did not want to pay for a proper engineer. He ate slowly, the way men eat who have gone hungry often enough to respect every meal. I fitted stamp mill water lines for 8 years, boiler repairs, mine drains. Anywhere water and iron met underground, I was the man they called when the real mechanics would not come. Why would they not come? Because the work killed people, Odman said. Hot pipes, bad air, cave-ins. The mechanics with families stayed in town. The ones without families went underground. He looked at Marit. You have a family, he said, and you are building a pressure system beside a hot spring. You understand why I stayed to help. Because you think I will get myself killed. Because you are doing it correctly, and I want to make sure you continue to. That was the difference. Every other person who had come to the gulch, Bell, Tollef, Dace's man, had come to tell her to stop. Odmund had come because he saw someone doing dangerous work with discipline, and he recognized it because he had spent a lifetime doing the same. Over the next 12 days, Odmund returned 5 times. He was not living in the gulch. He moved between jobs, sleeping where work took him, but he came back whenever his route passed within riding distance. Each visit brought a specific lesson. The 3rd visit, he taught her about union joints and cleanout ports. Mineral water, he said, left scale, not the thin film that Hardwell water deposited on a kettle. Hot spring water carried dissolved calcium, silica, and sulfur compounds that would coat the inside of iron pipe in weeks. If she did not build in threaded unions every 10 feet, joints she could open, clean, and reseal, the pipe would choke itself closed by midwinter. He made her install 4 unions along the dry pipe and mark each one with a chalk number. He showed her how to use a wire brush and a length of chain to scour the interior. He made her practice opening and closing each union until she could do it in gloves, in the dark, by feel alone. You will be cleaning these in a blizzard, Odmund said. Your fingers will not work. Your eyes will not help. Learn the threads now. The 4th visit, they built the delivery pipe. 50 vertical feet, 110 feet of actual pipe length following the cliff face, braced against rock with telegraph wire and iron spikes driven into cracks. They used every remaining foot of salvaged pipe Marit had collected, plus 12 feet of new 1-inch iron that Odmund bought in Boise with his own money and refused to let Marit repay. I am not giving you charity, he said when she argued. I am investing in the only interesting machine between here and Haley. The delivery pipe climbed the cliff in 3 runs connected by elbows, entered the cabin through a hole they drilled in the east wall, and fed into the heat exchanger, a loop of old stove pipe, and a cracked laundry boiler that Odmund had hammered back into shape. The loop sat behind the stove, against the wall, and the plan was simple. Hot water would pulse up from the ram, flow through the iron loop, give its heat to the cabin air, then exit through a return pipe that ran back down the cliff and emptied into the creek. A closed circuit. Hot water in, cooler water out, heat left behind, if it worked. They also built the relief bypass, a branch off the delivery pipe, fitted with a weighted valve that would open if pressure in the line exceeded what the fittings could bear. The bypass ran back to the creek. It was Marit's insurance against the scenario Bell had described: a stuck check valve, a failed air chamber, and a sealed column of hot water with nowhere to go except through the weakest fitting at lethal speed. Odmund tested the bypass 3 times. Each time he closed the delivery valve deliberately, let the pressure build, and watched the bypass pop open and dump the water safely. Each time the pipe shuddered but held. It is ugly, Odmund said, looking at the full assembly from the cliff edge. Ugly and loud and held together with wire, but the physics is right, the path is right, and the valves seat clean. He coughed. It was a deep, rattling cough that came from low in his chest, and he turned away so Marit would not see the effort it took to stop. She saw it anyway. She said nothing. December came like a door closing. The temperature dropped below 20 on the 1st, below 10 on the 5th. The creek froze at the edges, and the spring steam rose thicker, hanging in the gulch like a wall of white that smelled of sulfur and wet iron. On December the 21st, Marit opened the spring box gate, checked every union joint, confirmed the air chamber pressure by tapping the tube with a wrench and listening to the ring, and let the ram run. Clank. Pause. Clank. Pause. Clank. One beat every 2 seconds. Steady. The waste valve opened and closed with a rhythm that sounded like a slow heartbeat in the rock. She climbed back to the cabin and held a tin cup under the delivery pipe where it entered the wall. The cup filled with hot water in 3 minutes. Not fast, not luxurious, but continuous. The water was not boiling. The 50-foot climb and the iron pipe had cooled it to something below scalding but well above warm. She poured it over her wrist, the same wrist she had burned 7 weeks earlier, and the heat soaked into her skin. The radiator loop warmed slowly. After 2 hours, the iron was too hot to touch with bare hands. After 4, the wall behind the loop was dry for the first time since Marit had arrived at the cabin. Ragna put her swollen hands near the iron and held them there without speaking. Eli's cough did not stop, but the intervals between coughing lengthened from minutes to half hours. The ram had run for 4 straight hours. It had lifted hot water 50 feet without fuel, without steam, without $1's worth of power. The spring did the work. The falling water did the work. Marit had just given it a path. Bell would have told her 4 hours proved nothing. Tollef would have told her the fittings would split at the worst moment. Dace would have told her she had wasted weeks she should have spent earning wages. And Oddmund, if he had been there, would have said what he had said the last time he left. A machine that works in fair weather is only a promise. He was right. The ram ran steadily on December the 21st because the temperature was 18 degrees. The spring flow was strong, the waste valve was clean, and the air chamber held its cushion. None of those things were guaranteed in January. 9 days until Dace's deadline. The first $30 had to come from somewhere. Marit had spent $7 on fittings, thread compound, and lamp oil since construction began. She had $4.30 left. The debt was unchanged, but the cabin was warm, and Eli slept through the night for the first time in 5 weeks. The cold front arrived on January the 4th, 1892, and it did not come gradually. The temperature dropped 26 degrees in 9 hours. By midnight, the thermometer Tollef had nailed to his porch post read 14 below zero. The wind came from the north with nothing between it and the Arctic but open sage flats, and it hit the gulch like a wall falling. Snow began at dawn and did not stop for 31 hours. The road to Boise vanished. The cliff path became a chute of ice and blown white. The creek froze to the bottom in the shallow runs. Only the spring kept flowing because the earth beneath it did not care about the weather above. The ram clanked through the first night. Marit lay in the dark, listening to it, the steady beat coming up through the rock and the cabin floor, transmitted through the delivery pipe that entered the wall beside her bed. Clank, pause, clank, pause. The radiator loop threw heat into the room. The stove burned low. The woodpile held. At dawn, Eli could not stand. His fever had climbed during the night. His breathing was shallow and fast, a wet rattle on each exhale that sounded like paper tearing. Ragna pressed her bent hands against his forehead and looked at Marit with eyes that held no question. They both knew what this was. They both knew what it required: warmth, steam, liquid, and time, none of which existed if the cabin went cold. Marit fed the stove from the woodpile and checked the delivery pipe, Hot water still pulsed in. The radiator loop still threw heat. She boiled water from the delivery pipe, already hot. It reached boiling in minutes, and made Eli breathe the steam from a basin with a blanket over his head. He coughed until he retched, but the rattling eased. Slightly. Enough. Then the clank changed. It was subtle at first, a hesitation in the rhythm. Where there should have been silence between beats, there was a scraping sound, like iron dragging on stone. The pause between clanks lengthened from 1 second to 2, then 3. Marit put on every piece of clothing she owned. She tied a rope around her waist, secured the other end to the porch rail, and descended the cliff path in the storm. She could not see the ram body from 10 feet away. The steam and the blowing snow merged into a white nothing that erased the world. She navigated by the rope and by the sound, the labored, irregular clanking that came from somewhere below and to the left. She found the ram by touch. Her gloves were soaked through in seconds from the hot splash. The waste valve was the problem. Ice had formed around the splash zone where the wastewater hit the rocks. The splash froze on contact with the sub-zero air, and the ice had built upward, encasing the bottom of the waste valve in a shell that changed its weight and restricted its swing. The valve could not open fully. Without a full opening, the water could not build enough speed. Without speed, the hammer pulse weakened. Without the hammer, the delivery pipe went silent. Marit knelt in hot water and ice. She could not see the valve. She worked by feel, the way Oddman had made her practice. Her gloves were too thick for the hinge pin. She pulled the right glove off with her teeth. The cold hit her bare hand like a burn. She found the hinge pin. She found the ice. She chipped at it with the handle of the wrench she carried in her coat, breaking the shell away in pieces, clearing the valve's range of motion. The hub plate swung free. The water caught it. The valve slammed shut. The pipe jumped. The clank resumed. Marit reached for the wrench she had set on the rock beside her. Her right hand did not close. She looked down and saw that her palm had frozen to the wet iron of the ram body where she had braced herself. Skin and iron, bonded by water and cold. She pulled. The skin tore. A strip from the heel of her palm stayed on the iron. She climbed back up the rope with one hand bleeding into the snow and the other gripping the line so hard her shoulder cracked. The clank followed her up, steady again, for now. Inside, Eli's lips were pale. Ragna had piled every blanket in the cabin on him. The radiator loop was cooling. The minutes without the ram had let the iron temperature drop. Marit checked the delivery pipe. Water pulsed in again, but weakly. The air chamber. She could hear it in the sound. A harder, sharper clank that meant the air cushion had waterlogged. Without the cushion, every pulse was a hammer blow against the fittings instead of a smooth push. She could not go back down the cliff. Not yet. Not with her hand torn open and the storm still screaming. She found the bypass valve inside the cabin, the branch off the delivery pipe that Oddman had insisted on. She opened it slowly, bleeding pressure from the line, letting hot water pour onto the cabin floor and drain through the gap beneath the door. The hammering eased. The clank outside softened. The air chamber, relieved of the excess water that had filled its airspace, began to recover its cushion as the reduced pressure allowed air to re-enter the top of the tube. If you are invested in the story, subscribe and stay with us, because the next few hours decide whether Marit's machine is invention or scrap. The bypass water pooled on the cabin floor, steaming. Ragna did not complain. She placed Eli's basin in the pool so the hot water would keep it warm, and she held his head over the steam, and she sang to him in Norwegian while Marit wrapped her torn hand in a strip of flour sacking and watched the radiator loop slowly regain its heat. The ram ran through the night. The clank held, but Marit did not sleep. She sat against the wall with her bandaged hand in her lap and listened for any change in the rhythm, any skip, any drag, any silence that would mean the valve had frozen again. At 3 in the morning, she heard knocking at the door. Not the storm. A fist. Tolef Asen stood on her porch with his youngest daughter in his arms. Sunniva was 8 years old. Her fingers were white. Her cheeks were gray. Tolef's stovepipe had cracked in the cold, and the cabin had filled with smoke before he could repair it. By the time he got the pipe sealed, the fire had gone out, and the temperature inside had dropped below freezing. He had come to Marit's cabin because he could hear the clank. Through the storm, through the screaming wind, through the snow that erased every other sound in the gulch, he could hear the ram. And where the ram was running, there was heat. Marit pulled them inside. Sunniva's fingers went into warm water from the delivery pipe. Not hot. Marit tested it on her own wrist first, the burned one, because she no longer trusted sensation in the torn hand. Warm enough to thaw, not hot enough to damage tissue that had already been hurt by cold. Tolef sat on the floor with his coat still on and watched his daughter's fingers turn from white to red and listened to the clank below the cabin and said nothing for a long time. "I should have helped you build it," Tolef said. "You brought the wire," Marit said, "and the pipe. I brought them because I thought you would fail, and I did not want your death on my conscience. That is not helping. That is hedging." Sunniva's fingers curled around the cup. She began to cry, which meant the feeling was returning, which meant the frostbite had not gone deep enough to kill the tissue. Tolef put his forehead against the top of her head and closed his eyes. Outside, the storm continued. The ram continued. Both were violent. Only one was useful. By the second morning, word had spread through the gulch, the way word spreads in small communities during disaster, carried by need, not gossip. Kittel Hogland, an older prospector who lived alone in a dugout a quarter-mile north, had not been seen since the storm began. Tolef and a man named Embret Tveit broke trail to his door and found him on the floor, conscious but unable to stand. His fire had gone out sometime in the first night. His water bucket was frozen solid. His hands and feet had no color. They carried him to Marit's cabin because it was the only warm room in the gulch that was not fed by a fire someone had to constantly tend. The ram required no fuel. The spring required no stoking. The heat came up through the pipe, through the iron loop, and into the air, and it did not stop when everyone was too exhausted to feed it. Kittel Hogland survived. His left foot lost 2 toes. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But he did not die on the floor of a dugout with a frozen water bucket beside him. And the reason he did not die was that a clanking pipe contraption 50 feet below a widow's cabin kept pushing hot water uphill while the rest of the gulch's heat sources demanded wood, attention, and waking hands. Marit's cabin held 5 people by the second night. Marit, Eli, Ragna, Tolef with Sunniva, and Kittel on a pallet near the door. The room was 16 by 20 feet. It was crowded. It smelled of wool and sweat and sulfur. The floor was wet from the bypass water she had drained earlier, but the radiator loop threw heat, and the delivery pipe pulsed, and nobody was freezing. Eli's fever broke on the 3rd morning. Not dramatically, no sudden cool brow, no moment of clarity. The rattling in his chest simply began to loosen, one cough at a time, until the sound shifted from tearing to clearing. Ragna noticed before Marit did. She touched Marit's arm and pointed at the boy, who was sleeping without the blanket over his face for the first time in days. The stove had burned through less than a quarter cord in 3 days. Normally, keeping a cabin above freezing in that kind of cold required a full cord per week. Marit's woodpile, which had stood at just under a cord when the storm hit, was not gone. The spring had made the difference. On January the 7th, The storm broke. The sky cleared to a blue so deep it looked like it would crack. The temperature stayed below zero, but the wind died, and the world went still. Hiram Bell rode into the gulch that afternoon. He had heard about the storm damage from a freighter who had passed through Boise, and he expected to find frozen pipes, burst fittings, and a widow ready to admit defeat. He tied his horse at the porch rail and stood listening. Below the cliff, the ram clanked. Steady, one beat every 2 seconds. The sound carried in the still air like a pulse in the frozen ground. He touched the cabin's east wall where the delivery pipe entered. The wood around the pipe hole was warm. Frost covered the rest of the wall, but around the pipe, in a circle the size of a dinner plate, the wood was dry and warm to the touch. Marit opened the door. Behind her, Belle could see blankets hanging, bodies sleeping, steam rising from a basin on the floor. The air that came through the open door was warm, not summer warm, not comfortable, but warm enough that the people inside were alive, and the people outside their own cabins were not all so lucky. Belle looked at the pipe, the wall, the warm circle in the frost. He looked at Marit, whose right hand was wrapped in stained flour sacking, and whose face was thinner than the last time he had seen her. He did not speak. He walked to the cliff edge and looked down at the ram. He stood there for 5 minutes, watching the waste valve open and close, watching the water pulse, watching the steam curl around the iron. Then he came back. "How long did it run through the storm?" Belle asked. 3 days, Marit said. "It stopped once. I went down and cleared the valve." Belle looked at her bandaged hand. He understood what clearing the valve in that storm had cost. He did not say she had done well. He did not say he had been wrong. He said, "Your air chamber is undersized. If you find a larger tube, the pulse will smooth out, and your fittings will last longer." It was the first useful thing he had ever said to her. Not a warning, not a prohibition, an improvement. Marit nodded. Bell mounted his horse. At the edge of the yard, he turned back. "I told you it could not be done without a pump," Bell said. "I was wrong about the kind of pump." He rode out. Below the cliff, the ram clanked on. Above it, the cabin held its heat. And Marit Vangen stood on her porch with a torn hand and a sleeping boy and $4.30 and a machine that had just survived the worst the territory could throw at it. Dace Pritchard's deadline had passed 9 days ago. He had not come to collect. In a storm that deep, even creditors stayed home. But the storm was over now, and Dace would come. Dace Pritchard came on January the 11th, 4 days after the storm broke. He rode a borrowed horse because his own had thrown a shoe in the ice, and he brought a man named Voss who worked odd jobs at the store and served as witness whenever Dace needed something witnessed. They found a gulch that looked different from the one Dace had last visited. Smoke rose from Tollef's chimney. His stovepipe was repaired now, patched with a tin sleeve that Marit had cut from a bean can. Kittel Haugland sat on Marit's porch, in a chair Tollef had carried over, his feet wrapped in clean cloth, his face drawn but alive. From below the cliff, the ram clanked its steady rhythm, and the sound filled the gulch the way a heartbeat fills a chest, not loud, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. Dace dismounted and looked around. He had expected to find a failed claim, a broken woman, and an easy signature on a surrender document. He found 5 people who had survived a storm that had killed livestock across the valley and frozen pipes in half the houses in Boise proper. "You missed the deadline," Dace said. Marit stood in the yard. She did not invite him inside. "I did," she said. $30 by New Year's Day. That was the term. It is January the 11th. I have $4.30. Then the claim is forfeit. Tolif stepped off his porch across the yard. He had not been asked to join the conversation. He joined it anyway. The road was closed, Tolif said. No one could reach Boise to make a payment. No bank was open. No mail moved. You cannot forfeit a claim because a blizzard prevented payment. Dace looked at Tolif. Dace was a man who understood leverage, and leverage required isolation. A widow alone was leverage. A widow with a neighbor willing to speak was something else. The terms were clear, Dace said, but he said it with less volume than before. The terms did not account for an act of weather, Tolif said, and every man in this gulch will say the same if you take it to the county. Dace looked at Voss. Voss looked at the ground. Dace looked at the cabin, at the delivery pipe entering the wall, at the warm circle in the frost around the pipe hole, at the old man on the porch whose feet she had saved. He was calculating. Dace was always calculating. 30 days, Dace said. I will extend the first payment 30 days. February the 10th, $30. If it is not in my hand by close of business, I file with the county. He mounted the borrowed horse and rode out without waiting for Marit's answer. The deadline had moved, but the debt had not. $30 in 30 days. From a woman with $4.30 and no income except what the goat gave and the hens, who had started laying again now that the cabin was warm enough for them to roost inside the shed with the door closed. The goat gave milk. The hens gave eggs. The spring gave heat, but none of them gave cash. The conversions came one at a time, and none of them looked like surrender. Hiram Bell returned on January the 15th. He brought a notebook and a measuring tape and the professional demeanor of a man who has decided to treat something seriously that he previously dismissed. He did not announce that he had changed his mind. He simply began measuring. He measured the drive pipe slope, 9 feet of drop over 28 feet of run. He measured the delivery pipe length, 110 feet along the cliff face, 50 feet of vertical rise. He timed the waste valve cycle. 1 clank every 1.8 seconds, which was faster than Marit had estimated. He held his hand under the delivery pipe inside the cabin and counted seconds until the heat became uncomfortable. How much water reaches the cabin per hour? Bell asked. I do not know exactly, Marit said. Enough to fill the basin 4 times. Bell calculated in his notebook. 4 basins, each roughly 2 gallons, 8 gallons per hour, against a spring flow that Marit estimated at several hundred gallons per hour, pouring through the drive pipe and out the waste valve. The ram was lifting a small fraction of the total flow, perhaps 1 part in 40, and wasting the rest back to the creek. That is the principle, Bell said, almost to himself. The spring pays for the lift. Most of the water is spent to push a little of it higher. Yes. It is a pump, Bell said. He closed his notebook. I said it could not be done without a pump. I was wrong about the word. This is a pump. It simply uses the water itself as the engine instead of steam. He looked at the radiator loop behind the stove. He touched the iron. He pulled his hand back. Your loop is undersized, he said. If you added a second coil, another length of iron pipe, bent into a loop and connected in series, you would extract more heat from each pulse before the water returns to the creek. I do not have another length of pipe. I might know where to find one. That was the conversion, not an apology, not a dramatic admission of error, an offer to help improve what worked. Bell never said he was sorry for doubting her. He did not need to. The measuring tape said it for him. Tolif's conversion was quieter and had already happened, though he did not name it until weeks later. The night he had carried Sunniva through the storm to Marit's door, he had stopped being a skeptic. What remained was the slower work of becoming an ally. He began coming to the spring every 3rd day to help Marit clean the unions. The mineral scale built fast, a quarter-inch of white deposit in 10 days that narrowed the pipe bore and slowed the flow. Tollef learned the cleaning routine: close the spring box gate, drain the drive pipe section by section, open each union, run the wire brush through, scrape the valve faces, reassemble, reopen the gate, and listen for the clank to resume. It was ugly, tedious, necessary work. Tollef did it without complaint. He did not call it belief. He called it maintenance. His daughter Sunniva came with him sometimes. She was 8, sharp-eyed and unafraid of the steam. Marit showed her how to listen to the ram, how a steady clank meant the air chamber was healthy, how a sharper, harder beat meant the air cushion was waterlogging, how a skip in the rhythm meant scale was building on the waste valve seat. Sunniva heard the difference before Tollef did. She pressed her ear against the delivery pipe and said, "It sounds angry today." Marit checked. The waste valve seat had accumulated a ridge of calcium that was preventing full closure. She cleaned it. The rhythm smoothed. "She listens better than you do," Marit told Tollef. "She listens better than most," Tollef said. And for the first time since his wife had died, he smiled in a way that reached his eyes. The measurable results spread through the gulch by word of mouth, carried not by enthusiasm, but by arithmetic. Marit's household had burned less than 2 cords of wood through the worst cold stretch of the winter. Tollef, heating a similar-sized cabin with wood alone, had burned more than 4. Kittel Haugland, before his rescue, had been burning nearly a quart a week in his dugout because the earthen walls' wicked heat away faster than pine logs could replace it. The numbers were not dramatic. The ram had not eliminated the need for firewood, and Marit's cabin was not warm the way a Boise house with a proper furnace was warm. But the difference between 2 cords and 4 was the difference between a widow surviving the winter and a widow running out of fuel in February. Tollef, who understood practical arithmetic better than anyone in the gulch, put it in terms the men at Dace's store could follow. "She heated a cabin for 3 months on what I burned in 6 weeks, and she did not cut a single tree." That sentence traveled. It reached Embret Tveit, who owned a vegetable patch he could not irrigate without carrying buckets from the creek. It reached Birgit Solheim, who burned 2 cords a month heating wash water. It reached the families whose children attended the schoolhouse and shivered through lessons from November to April. People came to the gulch. Not many at first. A man named Embret Tveit, who had helped carry Kittel from his dugout, came to ask if a ram could lift cold creek water to his vegetating patch in spring. Marit told him it could, if his creek had enough drop, and she drew the layout for him on a piece of brown paper. A woman named Birgit Solheim came from 3 miles south to ask if hot spring water could heat a wash house. She ran a small laundry service and spent 2 cords of wood a month heating wash water over a fire pit. The spring nearest her property was cooler, perhaps 110 degrees, but it ran year-round. Marit could not answer that question with certainty. She told Birgit what she knew. The ram needed falling water and a certain minimum flow. If Birgit's spring provided both, the system could work. If the water was cooler, the heating effect would be less. Marit refused to promise what she had not tested. "Can you help me build one?" Birgit asked. "I can show you the principle," Marit said, "but you must build the clean-out ports and the bypass. Those are not optional. Without them, the machine becomes a weapon." The questions multiplied. Could a ram feed a greenhouse? Could it warm a chicken coop? Could it supply a schoolroom in winter? Could one be built for the mining camp above the North Fork, where 3 men had lost fingers to frostbite in December? Marit answered each question honestly, which meant she said, "I do not know," more often than "yes." She shared the principle freely. She refused to let anyone copy the dangerous parts, the valve assembly, the air chamber, the delivery line, without understanding the clean-out schedule, the bypass, and the signs of failure. She had learned from Odmund that knowledge without discipline was more dangerous than ignorance. Odmund Kavame returned to the gulch on January the 23rd, thinner than before and carrying his tool roll with less ease. His cough had deepened. When he spoke, the words came with pauses between them that had not been there in November. He inspected the ram without being asked. He checked every union joint. He tested the air chamber. He examined the waste valve seat and found a hairline crack in the hub plate that Marit had not yet noticed. "Replace it," he said. "Not next week. Now." A cracked valve face will shatter under repeated hammer impact, and when it does, it will send iron fragments through the drive pipe and jam every fitting below. They spent the day forging a replacement from a piece of flat iron stock that Bell had sent out from his shop, the first tangible evidence of the engineer's conversion. Odmund worked the bellows at Toluf's forge, while Marit heated and hammered the iron into shape. It was the first time they had worked metal together, and the collaboration had the rhythm of a conversation. Odmund controlled the heat, Marit controlled the shape, and the iron between them took form through mutual attention. During a rest, sitting on Toluf's woodpile while the new valve face cooled, Odmund told her about the stamp mill in Haley, where he had first seen a ram pump. Not a hot water ram, a cold water unit lifting creek water to a mill house on a hill. It had been installed by a Danish engineer who had learned the design from a French catalog, and it had run for 11 years before the mine closed. 11 years, Marit said. With maintenance, Odmund said. 11 years with someone cleaning the valves and watching the air chamber and replacing the leather seats when they wore. 11 years because someone understood that a machine is not a miracle, it is a relationship. Between what and what? Between what you build and what you are willing to tend. Marit thought about that. She thought about the daily cleaning, the scale scraping, the replacement valve they had just forged, the bypass she had bled in the dark during the blizzard. The ram was not a solution she had built and walked away from. It was a practice she had entered and could not leave. "What happened to the Danish engineer?" she asked. "He died in the mine collapse of '83, Odmund said. And the ram stopped working 6 months later because no one knew how to clean the valves." He coughed. This time the cough went on longer, and when he pulled his handkerchief away, Marit saw the stain. Dark, not rust-colored like old blood. Red like new. She did not say anything. Odmund saw her looking and put the handkerchief away. "I have been underground too long," he said. "The dust does not leave." Miner's lung. Marit had heard of it. Fine rock dust, breathed in over years, scarring the tissue until the lungs could not expand. There was no treatment. There was only time, and Odmund's time was shorter than either of them wanted to name. They disagreed that afternoon, and the disagreement mattered. Odmund wanted Marit to increase the drive pipe diameter, replace the 1-inch iron with 1.5-inch pipe, to capture more flow and generate a stronger hammer pulse. More force meant more water lifted. More water meant more heat. Marit refused. Larger pipe meant heavier fittings, harder hammer blows, more stress on every joint. The system worked as it was. It kept one cabin warm. That was what it needed to do. "It could keep more than one cabin warm," Odmund said. "Then I will build another ram, not a bigger one." "That is conservative. That is careful." Odmund stared at her. Then he laughed, a short, painful sound that ended in coughing. "You are right," he said. "Build what you can maintain, not what you can imagine." It was the last thing he taught her, and he taught it by losing an argument. Odmund collapsed on February the 4th. He had been clearing mineral scale from the springbox screen, a job Marit had told him she would do, but he had started before she came down the cliff. Tulef found him sitting against the stone wall of the spring box, with his tool roll open beside him and his hands on his knees, and his breath coming in shallow, rapid pulls that did not seem to reach his lungs. They carried him to the cabin. Ragna gave up her chair. Eli brought water. Marit knelt beside him and held his hand and felt the bones through the skin. Oddman did not give a sentimental farewell. He was not built for sentiment. He looked at Marit's hands, the scars from the iron, the calluses from the wrench, the split nail on her left thumb that had never healed properly, and he said, "Your hands look like a pipe fitter's." "They should," Marit said. "A pipe fitter taught them." Oddman reached into his tool roll and pulled out his valve file, a small, fine-toothed instrument with a wooden handle worn smooth by decades of use. He held it out. "Do not trust a smooth sound," he said. "Listen for the one beat that does not belong." Marit took the file. Oddman closed his eyes. He died during the thaw, 3 weeks later, in Tulef's spare room where they had moved him when it became clear he could no longer travel. The morning he died, the ram below the cliff missed a beat, a single skip in the rhythm, as if something had caught and released and then resumed. Marit heard it from the cabin. She went to the cliff edge and stood in the early spring air with the valve file in her coat pocket and the sound of the machine rising from below, like instruction from a voice that would not come again. The clank continued. 1 beat, pause. 1 beat, pause. Steady and imperfect and alive in the way that all tended things are alive, not because they cannot fail, but because someone has chosen not to let them. Spring arrived with a different kind of violence. The thaw came fast in 1892. Snow that had accumulated for 3 months melted in 2 weeks. The creek swelled. Ice broke free from the banks in slabs the size of doors and rode the current south toward Boise. The gulch, which had been silent under snow, roared with moving water. On March the 15th, the creek overtopped its banks near the schoolhouse, a quarter-mile downstream from Marit's cabin. The schoolhouse was a single-room frame building that served 11 children from 6 families. It sat 30 feet from the normal creek bank, which meant it now sat in 4 inches of moving water with more coming. The children were sent home. The men reinforced the bank with logs and rock. But the schoolhouse floor was wet. The stove could not keep the room warm with water running under the door, and 3 families whose homes were on the wrong side of the flooded creek had nowhere to send their children during the day. Embret Tveit came to Marit's cabin and asked a question no one had asked before. Could the ram heat the schoolhouse? The problem was different from heating her own cabin. The schoolhouse was farther from the spring. The delivery pipe would need to be 200 feet long instead of 110. The elevation difference was less, only 30 feet of rise instead of 50, which meant less resistance and potentially more flow. But the longer pipe meant more unions, more potential for scale buildup, more exposed joints where freezing could crack the iron. And Marit had no mentor to consult. Oddman was dying in Tulef's spare room, his breathing audible through the wall, his hands too weak to hold a file. Whatever she built now, she built alone. She spent 2 days calculating. She walked the route from the spring to the schoolhouse, measuring distance and drop with a plumb line and a length of string. She counted the exposed sections where the pipe would cross open ground and freeze in any cold snap. She estimated the heat loss over 200 feet of iron. At night, she sat at the table with Oddman's valve file beside her and worked the numbers on the back of a flour sack, checking each calculation twice because there was no one to check them for her. The hardest part was not the math. The hardest part was the silence where Oddman's voice should have been. Every decision she made, pipe route, valve placement, burial depth, she made by asking what he would have said and then listening to the empty room for an answer that did not come. She caught herself twice turning to ask a question before remembering there was no one to ask. Then she built it. Not alone, Tolliff and Embret helped lay the pipe, and Bell sent his assistant, a young man named Petter, to help fit the unions. But the design was Marit's. The valve timing was Marit's. The decision about where to place the bypass, where to bury the exposed sections under rock and straw for insulation, where to put the clean-out ports, all Marit's. The creek was still rising. Each morning brought another inch of water around the schoolhouse foundation. The men stacking logs along the bank worked with the urgency of people who could see their labor being undone in real time. A log placed at dawn would shift by noon as the current found its way underneath. Marit laid pipe alongside them, racing the water. If the flood reached the spring box before she finished the connection, silt would choke the intake screen and the whole system would need to be drained and cleaned before it could run. The schoolhouse line used a longer delivery run branched from the main spring flow with its own waste valve and its own air chamber. Marit kept the 1-inch pipe size, despite Embret's suggestion that larger would be better. Build what you can maintain, not what you can imagine, Oddman's words. She heard them in her own voice now, which meant they had become hers. They connected the delivery pipe to a radiator coil in the schoolhouse washroom, an iron loop salvaged from a decommissioned laundry boiler that Birgit Solheim donated. The coil sat against the back wall, and the plan was to warm the washroom first and let the heat migrate into the main classroom through the open doorway. The first test failed. A union joint at the 70-foot mark leaked. Hot water sprayed across the ground, and Peter, Bell's assistant, reached for the nearest fitting to tighten it. "Stop!" The word came out of Marit with the sharpness of someone who has seen what pressurized joints do to hands. Peter froze with his wrench in the air. "Open the bypass first," Marit said. "Bleed the pressure, then touch the union." Peter looked confused. Bell had not taught him this. Bell understood boilers and municipal pipe, systems with gauges and relief valves built into the design. He did not understand field-built rams where a single wrong move under pressure could turn a threaded joint into a projectile. Marit opened the bypass. The pressure dropped. The spray died. She tightened the union by hand, closed the bypass, and let the ram resume. As the clank steadied, she heard something, a faint unevenness in the new line's rhythm, a drag on every third beat that meant the delivery valve was not seating cleanly. She knelt beside the ram body and listened the way Oddmund had taught her, not to the sound itself, but to the sound that did not belong. She found a chip of mineral scale wedged under the delivery valve seat. She cleared it with the tip of the valve file, his file, the one he had pressed into her hand, and the rhythm smoothed. The coil warmed. The washroom warmed. The classroom, through the open door, warmed enough that the children who returned the next day did not need to keep their coats on for the first time since November. 11 children sat at their desk in shirt sleeves while floodwater ran past the building's foundation and a pipe clanked below the hill, and not one of them knew or cared how the heat reached them. They only knew it was there. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the next storm comes. Dace Pritchard filed his complaint on February the 28th, 2 weeks after Marit had failed to meet the extended payment deadline. But he did not file a claim forfeiture. He filed a public hazard notice with the county, alleging that Marit's spring works constituted an unregulated pressure system that endangered the health and safety of the community. It was a clever move. A claim forfeiture required a hearing where Tolliff and others could testify about the storm and the road closure. A hazard complaint required an inspection by the county engineer, and the county engineer was not Hiram Bell. It was Bell's superior, a man in Boise who had never seen the gulch and whose opinion could be shaped by whoever spoke to him first. Dace spoke to him first. Bell learned about the complaint from Pater, who had heard it in town. Bell rode to the gulch that evening. and for the first time, Marit saw him angry. "He filed a hazard notice," Bell said. "He's claiming your pipe system is an unregulated boiler. If the county inspector agrees, they can order it dismantled." "It is not a boiler," Marit said. "The waste valve is open every cycle. The bypass prevents accumulation." "I know what it is. The inspector does not. And Pritchard has described it to him as a sealed pressure vessel built from salvage by an unlicensed person." "Can you tell the inspector what it actually is?" Bell paused. In his professional life, he had always been careful about whose side he appeared to take. But he had measured Marit's system. He had timed the valves. He had felt the heat in the schoolhouse. He knew what the machine was, and he knew what Dace's complaint was. "I will write a report," Bell said. "I will describe the system accurately. I will note the safety provisions, the bypass, the open waste cycle, the clean-out schedule. I will submit it before the inspection." "Will that be enough?" "It should be, unless Pritchard has more leverage than I think he does." Tullough signed a statement that the system had saved his daughter's life during the January storm. Embret Tveit signed a statement that the schoolhouse line had been built to merit safety specifications and had operated without incident. Kittel Haugland signed with a mark, his hands still too stiff for a pen, attesting that he would have died without the heated cabin. Dace's hazard complaint went to the county inspector with Bell's technical report already on file. The inspector rode out in March, examined the system, opened and closed the bypass, listened to Bell's explanation of the RAM principle, and declared the system a non-pressurized water lifting device that did not fall under boiler regulations. Dace's complaint was dismissed. But the debt remained, $30 past due, 88 more behind it, and Dace Pritchard's patience was not a resource that replenished itself. He came to the Gulch one more time that month, not with Voss, alone. He stood at the cliff edge and looked down at the two RAM systems, Marit's original and the schoolhouse branch, clanking their overlapping rhythms in the steam. He watched for a long time. Then he turned to Marit, who had come out to the yard when she heard his horse. "That spring is worth more than you know," Dace said. "I know what it is worth," Marit said. "I live above it." "You owe me $118. The county will not block a debt claim the way they blocked my hazard notice. I can be patient, Mrs. Vangen. I can be very patient. And patience, in my experience, is worth more than pipe." He left. Marit stood in the yard and felt the ground vibrate with the double rhythm of the rams below, one for her cabin, one for the schoolhouse, and she understood that Dace was right about one thing. He could be patient. He could wait until summer, when the heating system meant nothing, and file his claim when the community's gratitude had cooled along with the weather. He could wait until the next election changed the county officers. He could wait until Tullough or Bell moved away, or died, or simply grew tired of defending a widow's right to own a cliff. The ram had kept her alive through winter. It had saved Sunova's fingers and Kittle's life and 11 children's comfort, but it had not paid the debt. And a machine that could not pay what was owed was, in Dace Pritchard's world, only a more interesting way to lose. Marit still had $4.30. The goat gave milk, the hens gave eggs, the spring gave heat, and the ram, clanking below the cliff in its steady, imperfect rhythm, gave her time. Time was not money, but it was the only thing she had that Dace could not take from her. Not yet. By the summer of 1892, Marit Vangen's days had acquired a rhythm that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who had stood beside a frozen wash line 13 months before. She woke before dawn. She checked the delivery pipe by touch. The warmth told her the ram was running before she heard the clank. She cleaned the spring box screen, a 5-minute job that prevented a 5-hour failure. She inspected the waste valve hinge for mineral buildup and wiped the delivery valve seat with a rag. She checked the air chamber by tapping it with a wrench and listening to the ring. A clear, high note meant the air cushion was intact. A dull thud meant water had crept in and needed to be bled. These tasks took less than 40 minutes. They kept the machine alive. The rest of the morning she spent teaching, not by choice, originally by demand. The families who had survived the winter in her cabin and the children who had sat in the warm schoolhouse had told others, and those others had told others. And by June there was a steady current of visitors to Van Gen Gulch who wanted to understand the clanking pipe that moved hot water uphill. Marit taught the way Odmund had taught her, through action, not explanation. She did not stand at a chalkboard and draw diagrams. She took people to the spring. She made them hold the drive pipe and feel the pulse. She made them listen to the waste valve cycle, open, build, slam, pulse, open, until the rhythm made sense in their bodies before it made sense in their heads. She had 3 rules for anyone who wanted to build a ram. First, install clean-out unions every 10 feet, and clean them on schedule, not when the flow slows. By the time you noticed the flow slowing, the scale had already narrowed the pipe by a 1/4 inch, and a 1/4 inch in a 1-inch pipe cut the flow by more than half. Second, build the bypass before you build the delivery line. The safety system comes first, not after, not alongside. First, if you cannot bleed pressure from a sealed line, you do not have a water system. You have a pipe bomb. Third, listen. Every day. The machine speaks. A smooth, steady clank means health. A sharp clank means the air chamber is failing. A skip means the valve seat is fouled. A silence means you are already too late. She taught Tolef to assemble a check valve blindfolded, by feel alone. She taught Sunniva to count clanks per minute and mark changes on a slate board hung near the delivery pipe. She taught Bell's assistant Peder to open the bypass before touching any union under pressure, and she made him practice until the sequence was automatic. Bypass open, pressure bled, union loosened, pipe cleared, union tightened, bypass closed. Every time. No exceptions. She taught Embret Tveit's eldest son how to lap a valve face with sand and tallow until the surface was smooth enough to seal without a gasket. She taught Birgit Solheim how to calculate whether a creek had enough drop to power a ram, a minimum of 18 inches of fall for every foot of desired lift, and how to measure the drop with nothing more than a plumb line and a piece of string. Each person who learned became a teacher to the next. The knowledge moved the way water moves, downhill, along the path of least resistance, filling whatever space was available. The improvements came from use, not from invention. Each week of operation revealed something the original design had not accounted for. The mineral scale was worse than Marit had expected. By April, the drive pipe's interior had narrowed enough that she had to disassemble and scour 4 sections in a single day. She built a settling barrel, a wooden cask set between the spring box and the drive pipe intake that allowed the hottest water to sit for several minutes before entering the iron. The pause let the heaviest mineral particles drop to the bottom of the barrel instead of coating the pipe. She cleaned the barrel once a week by pulling a bung at the bottom and letting the sludge drain into the creek. The leather valve seat on the delivery check valve cracked in May. The heat and mineral content had stiffened the leather until it split under the repeated hammer impact. She replaced it with layered rawhide treated in tallow, an idea from Odmund's mining camp repairs, where leather goods exposed to heat and moisture were preserved with animal fat to keep them supple. The rawhide seat lasted 3 times longer than the original leather. She added a removable strainer upstream of the waste valve, a cylinder of tin punched with small holes that caught any debris large enough to jam the valve face. The strainer was Sunniva's idea. The girl had been cleaning the waste valve one morning and found a pebble wedged under the hub plate, holding it open, stopping the entire cycle. She told Marit that if a basket could catch fish in a creek, a basket could catch stones in a pipe. Marit punched the tin that afternoon. The delivery pipe's exposed sections, where it crossed open ground between the cliff and the schoolhouse, froze during a late March cold snap, despite the hot water pulsing through them. The water was hot inside the pipe, but the iron conducted heat outward, and in sub-zero air, the heat bled away faster than the pulses could replace it. Marit and Tolef buried the exposed runs under layers of rock and straw, creating insulated channels that held the heat close to the iron. The problem did not recur. Dace Pritchard's store boiler failed on the night of October the 12th, 1892. It was not a dramatic failure. The boiler was old, a cast iron unit that heated water for the store's back room and the small apartment above where Dace lived. A seam had been weeping for months, leaving a rusty stain on the floor that Dace had ignored because repairing a boiler meant shutting it down, and shutting it down meant cold, and cold meant closing the store. He had chosen profit over maintenance. The seam chose the first hard freeze of autumn to let go. The boiler did not explode. It cracked along the weakened seam and dumped its water onto the floor in a single rush. The water flooded the back room, soaked through the floorboards into the cellar below, and froze there overnight. By morning, Dace's cellar contained $60 worth of inventory: barrels of molasses, crates of lamp oil, sacks of flour and sugar, sitting in 4 inches of ice. The molasses barrels had split. The lamp oil crates had shifted and cracked. The flour was ruined. Dace stood in his cellar in the dark, looking at the ice and the mess, and calculated his losses the way he calculated everything, quickly, accurately, and with a clear understanding of who could help and what it would cost him. He needed heat in the cellar to melt the ice before it damaged the foundation stones. He needed it quickly before the next freeze made the situation worse. His boiler was broken. His stovepipe could not reach the cellar, and the only person within 8 miles who knew how to move heat through iron pipe without a boiler was the woman he had been trying to remove from her claim for the past year. Dace rode to Vangen Gulch on October the 13th. He found Marit at the spring box cleaning the settling barrel. She saw him coming and did not stand up. She continued working, her hands in the warm water, her back to him, until he dismounted and stood behind her long enough that the silence became a conversation of its own. "I need your help," Dace said. Marit pulled the barrel bung and let the mineral sludge drain. She replaced it. She wiped her hands on her coat. Then she stood and turned to face him. "I need heat in my cellar," Dace said. "The boiler cracked. My goods are freezing." "You have a stove." "The stove cannot reach the cellar." "Then you need a pipe system." Dace said nothing. His jaw worked. He was a man who had built a career on being owed, and the experience of owing was physically uncomfortable for him, visible in the way he stood and the way his hands opened and closed at his sides. "I will help you," Marit said. "But I have a price." "Name it." "Written cancellation of the full debt. $118. Signed by you, witnessed by Tolef Asen and Hiram Bell, filed with the county clerk." Dace's face went still. $118 was money he had counted on collecting, one way or another, either in cash or in the claim itself. Canceling the debt meant losing both. "That is robbery," Dace said. "That is the price of knowing how to move heat through pipe," Marit said. "You told me once that a widow with no team has no business owning a cliff. The cliff disagrees." Dace looked at the ram clanking below them. He looked at the delivery pipe climbing the cliff face. He looked at the steam rising from the spring and the warm cabin above and the schoolhouse line running south. He was calculating. He was always calculating, and the calculation for the first time did not go his way. "If I cancel the debt," Dace said, "you help me save the cellar goods today, and you do not speak of this arrangement to anyone. Tolef and Bell will witness the document. They will know." Dace closed his eyes. When he opened them, the expression on his face was not anger and not defeat. It was the look of a man who has stepped into a snare he helped build. "Agreed," he said. They rode to town that afternoon. Marit brought Tolef and sent word to Bell. In Dace's store, with the smell of cracked molasses barrels rising from below and the inventory slowly freezing, Marit dictated the terms and Dace wrote them in his own hand. Full cancellation of all debts owed by Marit Vangen Nebrike, or the estate of Amos Vangen, to Dace Pritchard or Pritchard Mercantile. Tolef signed as witness. Bell signed as witness. Dace signed with a hand that gripped the pen as though it were a blade. Merritt built a temporary heating line from the store's backroom stovepipe through the floor into the cellar using a coil of iron pipe and a small circulating loop that drew heat from the stove and radiated it below. It was not a ram. There was no spring, no falling water, but it used the same principle of moving heat through iron to where it was needed. She worked for 4 hours in Dace's cellar, kneeling on ice, fitting pipe by the light of a single lantern, while Dace watched from above and said nothing useful and occasionally handed down a tool when she asked. The ice in the cellar began melting within hours. Water pooled and drained through the stone foundation's natural gaps. By the next morning, the floor was clear, and the temperature had risen enough to save the flour, the sugar, and most of the lamp oil. The molasses was beyond recovery. The barrels had split, and the thick syrup had mixed with ice water into a substance that would need to be shoveled out and hauled away. Dace calculated his losses at $22 for the molasses and another $8 for damaged crating, $30 lost, $118 forgiven. The arithmetic was not in his favor, and he knew it, and knowing it made the signing worse. Dace stood in his store watching Marit gather her tools and said nothing until she was finished. Then he said, "I still say it is an ugly thing." "So is winter," Marit said. She took the signed debt cancellation and rode home. The paper went into the flour tin, where $11.60 had once been the distance between survival and surrender. The tin now held $4.30 and a piece of paper that was worth more than every coin she had ever touched. Word of the exchange traveled through the gulch within days, as all exchanges involving Dace Pritchard traveled, carried by the people who noticed that a woman who had owed him money no longer did, and by the people who noticed that Dace had stopped mentioning the Vangen claim in his conversations at the store. No one said the word defeat. In the gulch, where everyone owed Dace something, his silence on the subject was louder than any admission. Marit did not discuss the terms. When Embret Tveit asked her how she had settled the debt, she said only that she and Dace had reached an agreement. When Birgit Solheim pressed for details, Marit said that the details were between her and her creditor. She understood, without anyone telling her, that humiliating Dace publicly would make him dangerous in new ways. A man who loses money can recover. A man who loses face does not forget. The partnership between Merritt and Hiram Bell became professional, deliberate, and productive. Bell brought engineering knowledge, proper measurement, load calculations, material specifications, and Marit brought field experience, what worked in sulfur water, what failed in cold, how to maintain a system when the nearest machine shop was 8 miles away and the road was frozen shut for months at a time. They argued about everything. They agreed on safety. That was enough. Bell drew up plans for an improved settling barrel with a copper screen and a threaded drain that could be serviced without tools. Marit built it and found that the copper corroded in the mineral water faster than iron. She told Bell. He redesigned with tin-plated iron. It held. That was the pattern of their work. Bell designed from theory. Marit tested against the spring, and the spring had the final vote. Their first project beyond the gulch was a cold water ram for a farmer named Herbrand Flaten, whose property sat below a creek with 12 feet of drop, over 60 yards. Her brand needed water for stock tanks on a bench above the creek, 40 feet of lift. Bell calculated the drive pipe length and diameter. Marit specified the valve weight, the air chamber size, and the clean-out schedule. They disagreed about the waste valve material. Bell wanted machined brass. Marit wanted cast iron, because she had seen what mineral water did to softer metals, and because her brand could not ride to Boise for brass replacement parts every time a seat wore down. They compromised. Cast iron valve with a brass seat insert that could be replaced without removing the entire assembly. It was a better solution than either had proposed alone, and it became the standard for every Ram they built afterward. The second project was another cold water unit for a family on the North Fork, and the third was the bathhouse Ram for the Boise Speculator, which required moving warm spring water through 250 feet of pipe to a soaking pool. The bathhouse Ram was the most complex system Marit had attempted: longer pipe, more unions, a higher flow rate, and a client who expected reliability, not survivalism. Bell handled the client. Marit handled the iron. The Ram ran for 3 years before the bathhouse closed for reasons that had nothing to do with plumbing. Each project taught them something. Each failure, and there were failures: a cracked air chamber at Flatton's Ranch, a frozen delivery pipe at the North Fork, a valve seat that wore through in 6 weeks at the bathhouse because the spring carried more grit than the settling barrel could catch, became a lesson that improved the next installation. Marit kept a journal of failures, not successes. She wrote down every crack, every freeze, every jam, every skip in the rhythm, because she had learned from Oddman's charcoal marks on the rock that failure was the only teacher who never repeated himself. The courtship between Marit and Tolaf Asen was slower than the professional partnership and quieter than the rams that marked its rhythm. It did not begin with a declaration or a gesture. It began with Tolaf showing up every third day to clean unions, and then every second day, and then every day, and then staying for supper, and then staying after supper to sit with Ragnia while Marit checked the evening valve cycle. He brought firewood without being asked. He mended the shed roof. He taught Eli how to sharpen a saw, and how to read a plumb line, and how to walk on ice without leaning back. He played drafts with Ragna using a board he carved himself, and he let her win when her hands were bad and did not let her win when her hands were good, and she respected him for knowing the difference. He did not propose. He was present, the way a good wall is present, not noticed until the wind blows. Marit noticed. Not quickly. She was a woman whose attention had been consumed by iron and water and survival, and the quiet arrival of a steady man did not register as change at first. It registered as absence of crisis. The mornings when Tolaf was in the yard felt different from the mornings when he was not, and the difference was not dramatic. It was the difference between checking the valve alone and checking it with someone standing near who would hand her the wrench without being asked. The moment she knew was not a dramatic one. It was an evening in late autumn of 1894, after the first frost. Tolaf had stayed for supper and then stayed to help Eli with his reading, and then Eli had fallen asleep over the book, and Tolaf had carried the boy to his bed without waking him. He set Eli down with the care of a man who had carried sleeping children before, and who understood that the gentleness required was not weakness, but a specific kind of strength. Marit watched from the doorway and felt something shift in her chest that she had not felt since before Amos died. Not desire, not yet, but the recognition that safety could come from a person and not only from a pipe. He proposed in the spring of 1895, standing beside the spring box because he could not think of any other place that felt like theirs. Marit said yes without pause, which surprised him. He had prepared for negotiation. She told him there was nothing to negotiate. She had made her decision the night he carried Sunniva through the storm to her door. Everything since then had been confirmation. They married in 1896 in a ceremony at the schoolhouse that the Ram had heated. Sunniva stood beside them. Eli stood beside them. Ragna sat in a chair near the radiator coil with her hands open in the warm air, and she cried, not from sadness, but from the specific relief of a woman who has watched her family nearly die and has lived to see them choose to grow. The years compress the way years do when survival is no longer the daily question. Marit and Tolef's first child, a girl named Birgit, after the laundrywoman who had donated the schoolhouse radiator coil, was born in 1897. A second child, a boy named Bernd, after Marit's father, came in 1899. They grew up with the sound of the ram the way other children grew up with the sound of a creek or a wind, as a constant that defined the shape of home. Birgit learned to count by counting clanks. Bernat learned to walk on the switchback path, holding Marit's hand while she checked the unions. Eli apprenticed under Hiram Bell at 14 and learned municipal waterworks, surveying, and pipe calculation. He had a gift for numbers that Marit recognized as her father's legacy, arriving through a different channel. By 20, he worked for the Boise Irrigation District, laying pipe for farmland that had been desert. He carried a small valve file in his coat pocket and could not explain to anyone why. When colleagues asked, he said it had belonged to a friend of his sister's. He did not say it had belonged to a dying blacksmith who had handed it to a widow beside a hot spring. Some inheritances resist summary. Sunniva Asen became the best valve listener in the Gulch. By 12, she could diagnose a fouled seat, a waterlogged air chamber, or a cracked hinge pin by ear alone, pressing her palm against the delivery pipe the way Marit's father had once pressed Merritt's palm against a mill pipe in Wisconsin. The knowledge had traveled 3 generations and 1,500 miles without being written down. It lived in hands and ears and the patient willingness to stand still beside a pipe and listen for what did not belong. Ragna lived until 1901. In her last years, she spent winter mornings in the small greenhouse that Marit and Tolef had built against the south wall of the cabin, a frame of salvaged window glass over a raised bed, heated by a branch of the delivery pipe that ran under the soil. Ragna grew greens in March, lettuce, radishes, a few stubborn onion sets. She could not grip a trowel, but she could press seeds into warm earth with the heel of her palm, and she did every spring as if planting were a form of argument against everything that had tried to take her family from her. The morning she died, the greenhouse was warm and the first radish leaves had broken the soil. Marit found her in the chair beside the raised bed, her hands open on her lap, her face turned toward the glass and the light coming through it. By 1895, Vangen Gulch had Marit's original cabin ram, the schoolhouse line, a wash shed using cooled spring water, the greenhouse, and 3 neighboring farms with cold water rams built to Marit's specifications. By 1900, the number had doubled. Not all of them used hot springs. Most used creek water, lifting it to irrigate gardens, fill stock tanks, or supply kitchens on hillsides that had never had running water. The principle was the same. Falling water spends most of itself to lift a useful part higher. The physics did not care whether the water was hot or cold. Only the maintenance differed. Dace Pritchard never became kind. Kindness was not in his inventory, but he stopped calling the machine foolish after the cellar incident, and he stocked pipe fittings and union joints without being asked, and he priced them fairly, and if anyone noted the change, he said only that the market demanded it. The market, in Dace's world, was the only force that could change a man without humiliating him. Marit let him have that story. She did not need his gratitude. She needed his fittings. Dace died in 1903 in the apartment above his store, with his accounts balanced and his debts collected, and not a single person in the Gulch who mourned him with warmth. But Marit went to the funeral. She stood at the back and said nothing, and left before anyone could ask her why she had come. She knew why. He had been the weight she had pushed against. and pushing against weight is how a person learns how strong they are. On a morning in 1904, the first hard snow of the season fell over Vangen Gulch. Marit was 51. Her hands were scarred and strong, and beginning to stiffen at the knuckles in a way that reminded her of Ragna. The ram below the cliff was not the original. Valves and pipes had been replaced piece by piece over 12 years, like a body replacing its own cells. But the spring box was the same, and the rhythm was the same, and the sound that rose from below the cliff was the same sound that had filled the gulch since the night Eli nearly stopped breathing. Marit heard the ram falter, a skip, a drag, the one beat that did not belong. She reached for her coat. She reached for the valve file in the pocket. She put one hand on the porch rail to push herself up. A girl, Suneva's daughter, 12 years old, born in the year the schoolhouse line was built, was already moving. She had heard it too. She was down the cliff path before Marit had her coat on, her boots sure on the switchback, her hands reaching for the waist valve hinge pin the way her mother had taught her, the way Marit had taught her mother, the way Oddmund had taught Marit, the way Bernd Brecke had once pressed his daughter's palm against a pipe in a grist mill and said, "Water moves, and when you stop it, it strikes." Marit sat back down. She listened. Below her, the rhythm stuttered, paused, and then resumed, steady, imperfect, alive. The knowledge had moved on. Within a decade of the first winter, 6 families in the Gulch used some version of the water lifting principle that Marit had built from a catalog page, a millwright's warning, and a blacksmith's file. Not all used hot springs, not all used rams, but all understood that falling water could be spent to raise a smaller portion higher, and all understood that the machine required tending, not faith. The town did not remember the math first. It remembered the sound, the iron heartbeat in the rock that meant someone had decided the cold would not win today. Marit lived out her life at Vangen Gulch. In later years, when visitors came to see the spring works, she made each one stand beside the delivery pipe before she explained anything. She wanted them to hear the unevenness in the clank, the slight drag, the occasional skip, the imperfection that was not a flaw, but a sign of a living system, before they admired the cleverness. She died in 1912, in the cabin above the spring, with the sound of the ram coming up through the floor the way it had come up through every night since the first winter. Tollef was beside her. The valve file was on the table. Snow fell over the gulch the night she died, and steam rose from the spring below, and the old pipe struck its iron beat in the dark, the way it had struck it through 13 winters and 100 storms and the deaths of everyone who had first built it. A deputy had once ridden to this cliff with a paper that gave a widow 90 days to pay her leave. A storekeeper had once stood in this yard and said that a widow with no team had no business owning a cliff. The cliff did not answer them. The water did, climbing 50 feet through iron and wire, one pulse at a time, not smooth, not pretty, not quiet, but steady enough that children in the schoolhouse had not feared the first hard freeze in years, and an old woman's hands had opened in warm air, and a girl on the switchback path could hear the one beat that did not belong and know exactly what to do about it. The cliff never became gentle. Marit simply taught the water how to climb it.